Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And this is Greg Hutchins.
Hi, Fred. Hey, Greg. Yeah, we were just chatting offline, and, I think one of the risks of getting older is that things start to fail and fall apart and stuff like that. So, wish you well. Hope everything gets healthy quick so you can get back on your surfboard and stuff like that. The season's coming up.
Yep.
But yeah, I've been hanging out next to the stove. I haven't cut my finger in a long time, so I'm doing good. So it's living high risk, with sharp objects around me. But hey, I saw something in my feed yesterday in LinkedIn, and it was a person making the argument that the risk matrices, I think you called them heat map, a 5x5 heat map kind of thing, and and I've always thought of it as a matrix that has occurrence versus severity, and it can be other things, but the heat map I'm thinking of is the red, yellow, green, occurrence versus severity. So high occurrence, high severity would get a red marker on it and stuff like that up, say in the upper right corner. And it was a tool for prioritizing which risks that you need to address. And the article, and I didn't keep the link to it, but the article was about that it's too subjective and it's misleading and there's better tools. And then didn't go on to say what the better tools were. So I thought, oh, I'll ask Greg. But and so I'm kind of at not knowing enough about this particular tool. I've used it a handful of cases, mostly associated with hazard analysis type stuff. But is it the right tool and why for prioritizing what risks need the most attention?
Boy, so, much like statistics, you can use it for almost anything and for any type of rationale. So I'll give you one of the challenges we have. We're developing an app based on the heat map, 5x5 type of grid.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big challenges right now throughout the world is how do you basically measure, manage, legislate, and enforce AI, artificial intelligence. It's a big deal. 10,000 academic papers have been written. There's been a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, chances are the legislation is going to say that 5x5 color-coded grid, what we call heat map, is okay. So, meaning, you can use it for regulating, measuring, and all that stuff for AI. Now, we have a whole bunch of other folks that say this is hogwash. Why? Because it's subjective, which is absolutely right. It basically says likelihood and consequence or severity, can mean different things to different people based on context, point of view, use case, a lot of stuff.
Well, I think of it as, one of the things I read in one of your books was the risk. I think it was risk appetite or risk tolerance, those kinds of concepts where one person is like, well, that's not a risk, that's not a problem. And so they rank the severity lower without them, and another person, oh, we can't afford to have even one glitch like that. And they give it a high risk rating. I think the subjective part is, I think what this guy's comment was, yeah, I'm wondering if they're looking at it the right way. Is, what's, and you've been in groups that are trying to prioritize this, that, or that, and everybody's got an opinion. And like, yeah, everybody's got something else too, but it doesn't matter for this discussion.
So we divide this into two worlds. Do you want to basically, let's look at AI just for a second. A lot of what we would call the high-end tools in risk were causal. You had inputs, you had a process, you had an output, and they were a causal relationship
Yeah,
between input and output.
yeah,
Then basically, probably 15, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of the tools, risk tools, were, and by the way, causal is deterministic. Then the tools became what we would call correlative. You had inputs, you had outputs, you had a process, and then we looked at correlations between the inputs and the outputs. Now, because of AI, it's chimerical, it's hallucinogenic. We don't understand. And we just had a discussion about this morning. Um, we spent 6 weeks with Georgia Tech discussing this. Inputs and outputs in AI are not explained, or you cannot explain it. So back to your 5 grid. In the absence of a good method for understanding risk, a heat map is okay. Why? Because it's a heuristic. You know what I mean by heuristic?
yeah, yeah.
Rule of
But
thumb. Rules of thumb.
yeah, yeah. It gives you a guideline,
A
and
guideline. Yeah, it's a guideline.
so it's okay. The issue is that if you and I individually set up a 5 by 5 and we had, say, 20 things brainstormed that were risks for our particular project or factory or whatever, and or even an AI agent or something like that, we come up with some list. The number one issue is did we get the right list of things? Two, then how do we um, prioritize these things, and minimize the subjectivity. That's what I'm really interested in, is if it's okay to use, well, how do you do it well?
And that's the critical issue. You hit a run on the nose, Fred. How can you take this tool, which essentially is subjective, and make it better? We have that in FEMA's, failure modes effects analysis.
Mm-hmm.
We have this in a lot of, because largely they're discretionary tools.
Well, in FMEA, I often, we're rank, we have a whole bunch of, say, failure causes or whatever. And it's not so much that some people advocate you go find the actual failure rate, or you go to the research and do the history and find out what the rate of failure is, get an actual number. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that. And there's some things we just don't have information for. But, well, is this likely with this team that we're talking here? Will this happen more often or less often than another thing? And then you keep iterating on that. And then you have a rank order list. And then you break it up into, this is very likely, this is not very likely. It's just a rank order. Is that a technique for these heat maps to say, well, is this going to occur more often or less often than other things in the year? Because at the end of the day, we just want to know which ones we want to pay attention to. It's not their absolute, which it's, I think in your description of it, regulatory and doing all those things, then the just the rank ordering is probably not sufficient. What is the absolute risk, which would be a numeric occurrence and a dollar number next to consequences? Because we really don't need regulations for things that at the end of the day really don't matter. But it might be the most serious risk that we're facing for our particular discussion. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So about a year ago, I had a client, and you know, boy, it was a budgetary time of the year, and I really wondered how they made decisions. Any strategic decisions.
There's a lot of people wondering. That's a whole field of philosophy.
Well, it's philosophy, it's game theory, it's a whole bunch of stuff. But it really came down to deciding how to decide. And at the end of the day, they didn't have a good mechanism for, I mean, at a corporate level, deciding how to decide. So we brought in the heat maps because they're heuristics, they're
Mhm.
easy to understand. Uh, some folks were heavy into maths, engineers. Some of them,
Mhm.
HR folks, were in
How
a
do we feel
Poisson.
about this today?
Yeah, they didn't know a Poisson from a Gaussian. It's just
Mhm.
wasn't part of their knowledge base. So for us, in that case, there's C-level folks. they liked the idea of a heat map. On the other hand, we had the engineers in these discussions who said, no, 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 this is bullshit. Yes, sorry for
Hmm.
that. We want to use Monte Carlo, we want to use Bayesian, we want to use all these things. And I said, okay, great. And then they started throwing things around, which were quite often incorrect, that everything is predictable and Bayesian can explain everything, blah, blah, blah. Anyway,
Right, right,
the
yeah.
bottom line was the HR folks, head of HR and the head of a lot of the other areas who weren't engineers, the heat map was fine. The engineers finally got around to the heat map because, quite frankly, nobody understood Bayesian or Monte Carlo. So, depending upon the context, heat maps work. Now, you know, the problem is no tool will be able to predict the future. That's sort of an oxymoron, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's you got inputs of what you know. You walk into
That's
the
right.
room with some knowledge, and sometimes you tease out some not necessarily new insights or new knowledge, but you know part of like just basic brainstorming is I'll say something about a penguin, and somebody else will go, oh, black and whites. Oh, what about uh, police action that take down this road or for our supply chain? It's it's the idea that probably wasn't on the list until something sparked the memory of it or the thought of it. I think that's one technique. Let me shift gears a little bit. One technique I've used
Uh-huh.
more for FMEAs, but I think it would work when you have debates over numbers versus this, that, or the other thing is go, all right, here's the list of risks that we think is the number of things that we're facing. We can't solve them all. We need to prioritize the higher severity and the higher recurrence ones.
Pareto.
And right. And like it's the heat map. I like that term for it. And I find for some odd reason, which might be a subject for a whole nother podcast, is senior managers for whatever reason really love red, yellow, green charts of any kind. It's just I maybe they're sea level because they're not colorblind, or maybe they're colorblind and they just like charts or something. Whatever. I digress. But the idea is that you got five people in the room. Everybody's got a point of view, and you've heard that fable about five blind men
Yep.
or about an elephant, and they're all describing it in different ways. Well, each point of view is valid, and each set of history and background is valid. It's their point of view, and that's why they were invited to the meeting. All right, here's risk number 106, whatever ones we called it. And somebody says it's low, somebody says it's high, and the rest go, it's in the middle. One technique I've run into is you say, all right, we're not going to debate this with all 5 points of views. All right, the person that's saying it's low, why do you say it's low? What's your evidence? And just, what's the legal, I don't say legal argument, what's the argument why you're saying it's low? And then the other end, you say, all right, why do you say it's high? And they say some stuff, and then you poll the room again, because those 2 points of views may pull people one way or the other, change their minds. You don't need to justify it as you're scoring it initially. It's kind of, if everybody agrees, you're done. But getting not to a consensus, but to a second round is a way to just get more information into the group to move forward with it. Have you ever done something like that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because, the people who go to the heavy technical numerical explanations miss the fact that you can't really measure uncertainty. It's
Well, I'm a statistician. That's our business. But yeah, I get your point, because the uncertainty of we don't even know if we have all the information.
or the right type of information from the right sources, on and on and on,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah,
You know,
it's not the variance of a set of numbers, which is the uncertainty I like to deal with, because I can deal with it. With the other uncertainty, do we even have the right? Are we in the right room to be able to discuss this properly, or those kinds of things?
and it comes down to context again.
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with people, having something that's visual, like a heat map, create some type of understanding, among people to basically say, yeah, I get the problem. I understand the problem. I don't think I have the solution, but at least I understand I have some inkling of the problem. And oh, by the way, this is a process for deciding how to decide. You know, you know,
Hmm.
you'll get the high number, low number, you'll average them out, you'll do something, right? And at least there's some basis for a decision as opposed to gut or, taking something from the, sky plucking it, as we used to say, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's another issue though that I run into is with this kind of process, whether it's FMEAs or these risk matrices and so on, is
Uh-huh.
oftentimes somebody wants to pre-fill it in, or the first person that says, "Oh, that's a high risk." It creates an anchor
Yep.
that then there's a debate over, well, how much of a high risk is it versus is it really a high risk or not? And I know you've been in groups where there's one person may dominate the entire discussion, which is a fault of the facilitator. But even if just the first person's, oh, that's high risk, just says that, and it skews the group immediately. It's how do you get over one? Because if you pre-fill it out and put it up on the chart, it's an anchor, right? It's then tweaking it, it's spell checking it versus creating it from scratch. And so, how do you get over or around the idea that what I call anchoring of the discussion?
You need a good facilitator. Am I personally a good facilitator? No. There are a whole bunch of decision-making biases. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you can basically go to Wikipedia and you'll pull out over 100 decision-making biases, that article. There's
Mm-hmm.
the highest paid person in the meeting, right?
Yeah, or the highest perceived ranking person, or the one people feel safe with or trust, or and on and on and on.
Exactly. There's the bias, there's the legitimacy bias. There's the thing that we want to reinforce our predisposed thinking bias, right? There's a whole
Mm-hmm.
bunch of biases. But if we can basically say, here's a process for deciding and put down, say, 5 biases that we all have, right? That we're predisposed to do, then at least we have a better, what I would call guardrails for making better decisions.
Uh, that reminds me. Have you ever heard of the five hats or colored hats or something like that?
No, I haven't.
It might have been just the hallucination of this one consultant that we were working with at one point, but it is a system. I looked it up a couple of times, but um, it was based. The idea of the facilitator would say, "All right, we're going to look at this analytically," and I think that was the black hat, and we're going to look at this emotionally.
Yep.
And what she was doing was setting different anchors for perspective, and it was kind of touchy feely but that was deep in engineering at that point. So I kind of like, this sounds flaky. What it did though is it allowed us to essentially shift our point of view and perspective, and let's look at this from a safety point of view. Let's look at this as for an opportunity point of view. And I don't remember what the 5 things were, yet it was phenomenal when I look back at that experience, is that by just suggesting a different way to think about a particular issue, it shifted your thinking to a different framework, a different anchor, a different bias. So that might be some way to do it. But I think, like you said, Greg, is if you identify the various biases and make it conscious, that reduces the prevalence of it. Not always. Some people are just going to carry their biases wherever they go and use them, whereas others will be conscious of that and take steps to guard against it. But back to the start is the matrix itself. Yes, it's not perfect. Yet I think your point, though, Greg, in the kind of as a summary, is that it's good enough. It can be better when it's facilitated well. And then we talked about a handful of ways to go about doing that. Um, yeah, it's a wonder we make decisions at all.
Well, most companies, they don't have a method or mechanism for making decisions. It's normally the highest
or
ranking,
people guessing what they're going to decide,
yeah, politically, or guessing what the customer wants. So if there's a
Yeah.
process, and the heat map, not perfect, it's a heuristic, it's a rules of thumb. And as long as we understand the biases, good is good enough quite often.
Yeah. I, I had a boss once that I was starting a new job, and he said he had a couple of principles. And number one was never fail to make a decision. He says, you can be wrong and we'll learn from it. And you can be right, and that's great. And we'll reinforce it. But if you don't make the decision, I consider that a failure, of leadership. And it was a leadership role that I was in. And so having a tool to help the organization get to, well, these 4 things we need to take care of, that's a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're off and running. You go off and do it. If each person in the group has got their 5 favorite and they all don't overlap, now you're the lack of decision is actually costing you and your organization effort and resources and focus and everything else, which is not a good thing by any standard. But if you're listening to this, if you got a preference on heat maps or these risk matrices or other tips to help make them really work effectively, let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR, and you can find a couple of ways to get in touch with us. Greg and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. And some ideas get sparked by what we see and what's coming across our desk and screen and stuff like that. And others, the ones we enjoy the most, are the ones that you send us. That success stories, questions, disasters. How do I do this better or whatever? All of those are good. So send them on over. Hey, Greg, without a heat map or a way to sort this out, other than my stopwatch here is going, we got about 20 minutes or so. I think we'll sign off on this one.
All righty, Fred. This has been fun. Just a quick story. Years ago, I had a boss, and he basically said to me one day, if the 2 of us are making the same decisions all the time, one of us is not needed. That was my light bulb moment.
That's a good one. I like that. All right. Thanks, Greg. Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.